brother, and welcome to the fourth edition of the Grand Master's Q&A for the Grand Lodge of New Hampshire. For those of you who are expecting the Grand Master to welcome you, he has asked me to coordinate the program for this evening. And for those of you who don't know me, my name is Dan Hotchkiss, and I am your Senior Grand Warden. In addition, I will kind of play host for the evening. And I'll give you a brief rundown of the agenda. I will introduce the Grand Master in a minute or so, and he will talk about the status of Freemasonry here in New Hampshire as it relates to COVID-19 and answer any of your questions that you may have as a result of that. Following his portion of the program, he will turn it over to myself, and I will read to you the Declaration of Masonic Principles that are in our Grand Lodge Constitution. We felt it would be a nice area to review given the situation that we're currently in with COVID. And following that, I will introduce you to our Right Worshipful Grand Education Officer, Right Worshipful David Ackbridge, who will present a program on the cable tow of New Hampshire's Masonic Principles to Anderson's Constitutions, as well as provide you a brief explanation of the various principles. So now it gives me a great deal of pleasure to introduce to you the most worshipful Grand Master of the most worshipful Grand Lodge of the ancient and honorable fraternity of free and accepted Masons of the state of New Hampshire, most worshipful brother Kenneth Ansel Clay Jr.
Thank you, Right Worshipful Brother Dan Hotchkiss. I appreciate the introduction. Brethren, I hope you're having a fine evening. So with respect to COVID, one of the things that I did along the lines of my installation is I asked the district deputy grand masters to reach out to each of the worshipful masters throughout this jurisdiction to try and find out if there are brethren who have been impacted in some way by the pandemic, whether that be sickness, tragically loss of life, or job loss. And I've received a number of reports back. I want to thank my district deputy grand masters. They've done a fantastic job throughout this process. And I'm very pleased to say that there are some brethren who have been impacted, but the extent of that impact is not as dramatic as I would have feared. So that's the good news. The not so good news is that there are brethren out there who are hurting. We need to make sure that we're reaching out and helping them. So one of the good things about doing this survey, if you will, to find out if there are brethren who have been impacted, is it provides you, worshipful masters, the opportunity to work with your brethren to do whatever it is that we can to support a fallen brother. So I'm calling upon worshipful masters, membership committee chairmen, whoever it is that the worshipful masters have delegated within their lodges to make sure that someone is in contact with these brethren to do whatever we can to help relieve the distressed. Now, the next thing I want to say is that I came out with an announcement this last Friday, May 29th, extending the time where we are unable to meet face-to-face for a couple more weeks. But on June 15th, it is my hope that certainly within the bounds of the order given by our governor and within CDC guidelines, we will be announcing what I refer to as a Masonic reentry plan. That plan is going to be comprised of 3 phases. The first phase is the reactivation of stated meetings and special communications. One of the things that I'm going to do, brethren, is understanding that many of you have lost the ability to hold stated meetings over the last few months, and a number of you are entering that period where you go dark over the summer. I'm encouraging worshipful masters to strongly consider holding special communications over the summer in an effort to bring our brethren together. You'll be receiving guidelines on how best to do that during that time. So look for that sort of guidance to come out within the next few weeks. Now, following that first initial phase where we will be having stated and special communications, down the road, at a date to be determined, we will then be starting to reactivate degrees. Now, for obvious reasons, for those who are on this line who are Masons, you understand that the way in which we conduct our degrees makes it very difficult given CDC guidelines. So that's why there's going to be a bit of a pause before we're able to do degrees. So one may ask, well, what impact does that have on inspections? I'm working with Right Worshipful Brother Busby and his district deputy grand lecturers on a plan, hopefully, that we will be introducing that allows you to hold inspections later this summer. I would strongly discourage anyone from planning any inspections in the month of June and potentially in the month of July. But stay tuned for further guidance on that. The last stage that we will be introducing is the return of veterans and special ladies programs. Now, unfortunately, as much as we love to recognize our veterans and special ladies, this is a demographic that makes it very challenging to bring them together in groups. So for their best interests and to ensure their safety and security, this will be the last Masonic activity that we will be starting up. In the interim, I've asked Right Worshipful Brother Mark Langis and the office staff to start working on a letter. So if there are veterans that over the last few months during this period where the pandemic has been upon us, who would normally have been entitled to receive their veterans pin, jewel, or plaque, Right Worshipful Brother Langis is going to make sure that those brethren are recognized during that time. And then when we're able to get back together face to face to formally recognize these veterans, we'll make sure that happens. So that's a quick update on what's happening with respect to so the COVID and pandemic situation. So I'm going to turn it back to Right Worshipful Brother Hotchkiss to see whether he would like to manage any questions that we might be receiving at this time.
Thank you, Grandmaster. Brethren, if you have any questions, I would certainly ask that you place them forward, and Right Worshipful Brother Busby will get them so that we can forward them to our Grand Master for his addressing them.
We'll give this just a moment, brethren, for you to submit your questions. And if we don't receive any in the next minute or two, then we will continue with the program. Let me just say, while we're waiting to see if there are any questions coming in, that I owe a tremendous debt of gratitude to your Grand Lodge line officers, Right Worshipful Brother Collins, Hotchkiss, Borthwick, Sprague, and Patuan have done a fabulous job supporting me in communications, making sure that everyone understands what's taking place. They, in concert with our communications committee led by Right Worshipful Brother Busby and Right Worshipful Brother Langis and the office staff, have just been absolutely top-notch throughout this period. So I appreciate that very much. It would appear there might be some questions coming in, Dan.
Grandmaster, from Brother John Glover, which phase or phases do dinners, collations, table odds, etc. fit into, assuming there's a plan for those?
Well, Right Worshipful Brother Glover, that depends on whether ice cream's being served or not. But what I'm going to be doing in the initial phase is I will not be allowing collations to take place in an indoor setting. So typically in a lodge, either before or after a meeting, you'll be downstairs, you'll have a collation. I realize there may be some ways of doing that in buffet style. They may seem safe, but I would prefer to err on the side of caution. And I believe that the introduction of collations will take place at a later date. Now, that does beg the question, what if we wanted to do an outdoor cookout? What I would ask in that case, brethren, is that you submit any requests to do a collation outside to the Grand Lodge office. They will funnel them and send them to me for my evaluation.
Thank you, Grand Master. Another question from Worshipful Brother Joe Rella. Where do visitations fall into the plan? They are among the heaviest attended and for the longest period of time.
So I'm going to defer that question to Right Worshipful Brother Collins if he would like to address that.
Thank you, Grandmaster. So, brethren, when it comes to visitations, again, those are going to be under the same guidelines that we're meeting. I mean, it's going to be, it's going to be part of the phased-in approach, and we're certainly going to be looking at, looking at social distancing. We're going to be looking at potentially wearing face masks, hand sanitizers. This thing's going to be looking at doing that, but on the phased-in plan, that will not be of the initial plan. That will probably on the second phase. So what I think the Grand Master is talking about is we're going to start meeting just at the lodge level, where lodges meet and can distance, and certainly avoid heavy like dinners where people are sitting side by side each other. But I think it's part of the phased-in approach. That's what's going to be as well. If you heard the Grand Master talk, he also mentioned that visitations really, if you're planning anything, that should be pushed off at this point, really to July. I think what we're trying to do is phase this in so there's no issues. Not trying to be frustrating. It's been frustrating to the Grand Master and everyone here. All we're trying to do simply, brethren, is make sure that we're being safe, make sure everything's working properly, and that when we do get to these bigger meetings like visitations, that we can do it in a safe format and everybody understands. Because as well, my brother, I think something you got to understand is, I think you'll find that some of our elderly brethren, which are a lot of them, they may be very hesitant on attending any larger functions for a period of time. They may wait a period of time. There are other brethren that may think, no problem. So again, we're trying to look at the safest avenue possible and the safety of you and everybody at the lodge.
Thank you, Right Worshipful.
Grand Master, question, is the maple sugar game canceled?
So the good news is, brethren, that to the best of my knowledge, that event is still moving forward. I will let you know as soon. So this is based on information I received a week ago from the Grand Master of Vermont, Most Worshipful Brother Stu Corso. He did notify me that plans are moving forward for that event, which is terrific. If I hear anything different, I will let you know.
Thank you, Grand Master. From my worshipful Larry Gullett, for degrees, are we looking at September or later?
Don't know, to be perfectly honest with you. Brethren, here's the issue. We're talking about an individual. I've got to be careful what I say because on YouTube, there's no way to secure this line. When we present degrees, we do it in such a way that the candidate perhaps is not aware of the direction in which he's traveling throughout the lodge, and therefore is seeking assistance from a brother to help him. That procedure would, in all likelihood, violate current social distancing rules. Until the CDC relaxes those guidelines, the conducting of degrees will be very challenging. What I will say is this. Right Worshipful Brother Langis sent me a report just the other day, and there's quite a backlog of candidates waiting to receive their degrees. I'm currently working with the Grand Line on a plan where the Grand Lodge could potentially help to put together a program to conduct a degree in a safe and secure manner that can help you with some of these candidates and brethren who are looking to advance through their Masonic journey. Stay tuned for further information on that. It's too early to talk about it now, but clearly the way that we perform our degrees is challenged under the current social distancing rules, and therefore it's something that we're simply going to have to wait for until those guidelines are relaxed. I hope that answers the question, Larry.
Thank you, Most Worshipful. And a question from Right Worshipful Dennis Tuttle. I have a centenarian special lady. When might we be able to present her with her award?
Right Worshipful Brother Borthwick. Scott's on mute. Here he comes.
Yes, most worshipful.
So as chairman of Special Ladies, Scott, any thoughts on that?
Well, as far as I know, if Mark's on the line, there is a certificate ready for her, because I thought the original presentation was going to be in April, but of course that got canceled. So how do you want to do it? I mean, we can either mail it to her or have Dennis deliver it.
What I would like is, Dennis, if you would be so kind as to please contact Right Worshipful Brother Borthwick directly and talk about what is the most appropriate way to recognize this well-deserving special lady in a dignified way, understanding that it cannot be done safely face-to-face right now.
That works.
Thank you, Scott.
Thank you both. Most worshipful, I actually don't see any other questions right now.
Very good. Thank you. So, Right Worshipful Brother Hotchkiss, I will turn the program back to you.
Thank you, most worshipful. So, brethren, as I mentioned, our program this evening is going to be discussing the declaration of our Masonic principles that are in our Grand Constitution. And I chose this topic partly because, knowing in the difficult times that we were currently in, I thought it would be beneficial to remind us, one, of what Masonry is and what it's not, and to also remind us that these principles help guide us in the development of our own temple and character, and they are the foundation on which Masonry bases its teachings. Now, the Declaration of Masonic Principles can be found in our Grand Constitution at the very beginning. It actually is the one page that falls between the end of the table of contents and the first article of our Grand Constitution. So I expect or suspect that it's probably a page that gets often overlooked. And therefore, I felt it was probably an important topic to discuss and review, and kind of think of them as the preamble to our Grand Constitution. So now, brethren, I'm actually going to read the Declaration of Masonic Principles in their entirety. And I would certainly request that you actively listen to each of them and consider their relevance, not only in your Masonic life, but also in your daily lives and your interaction with your community. And as I'm reading them, you'll actually be able to see them on the screen, as Right Worshipful Brother Busby has shared his screen. So, brethren, here are the declaration of our Masonic principles in our Grand Constitution for the Grand Lodge of New Hampshire. Freemasonry is a charitable, benevolent, educational, and religious society. Its principles are proclaimed as widely as men will hear. Its only secrets are in its methods of recognition and of symbolic instruction. It is charitable in that it is not organized for profit, and none of its income inures to the benefit of any individual, but all is devoted to the promotion of the welfare and happiness of mankind. It is benevolent in that it teaches and exemplifies altruism as a duty. It is educational in that it teaches by prescribed ceremonials a system of morality and brotherhood based upon the sacred law. It is religious in that it relies upon a belief in monotheism. The volume of sacred law is open upon its altars whenever a lodge is in session. Reverence to God is ever present in its ceremonial, and to its brethren are constantly addressed lessons of morality. Yet, it is not sectarian or theological. It is a social organization only so far as it furnishes additional inducement that men may foregather in numbers, thereby providing more material for its primary work of education, of worship, and of charity. Through the improvement and strengthening of the character of the individual man, Freemasonry seeks to improve the community. Thus, it impresses upon its members the principles of personal righteousness and personal responsibility, enlightens them as to those things which make for human welfare, and inspires them with that feeling of charity and goodwill toward all mankind, which will move them to translate principle and conviction into action. To that end, it teaches and stands for the worship of God, truth and justice, fraternity and philanthropy, and enlightenment and orderly liberty, civil, religious, and intellectual. It charges each of its members to be true and loyal to the government of the country to which he owes his allegiance, and to be obedient to the law of any state in which he may be. It believes that the attainment of these objectives is best accomplished by laying a broad basis of principle upon which men of every race, country, sect, and opinion may unite, rather than settling up a restricted platform upon which only those of certain races, creeds, and opinions can assemble. Believing in these things, this Grand Lodge affirms its continued adherence to that ancient and approved rule of Freemasonry, which forbids the discussion in Masonic meetings of creeds, politics, or other topics likely to excite personal animosities. It further affirms its conviction that it is not only contrary to the fundamental principles of Freemasonry, but dangerous to its unity, strength, usefulness, and welfare for Masonic bodies to take any action or attempt to exercise pressure or influence for or against any legislation, or in any way to attempt to procure the election or appointment of government officials, or to influence them, whether or not members of the fraternity, in the performance of their official duties. The true Freemason will act in civil life according to his individual judgment and the dictates of his conscience. So, brethren, those are the Declaration of Masonic Principles outlined in our Grand Constitution. And it is interesting that these principles were not formally adopted by our Grand Lodge until May 17th, 1939. And although their origins are certainly much older, as our Right Worshipful Grand Education Officer, Right Worshipful Dave Ackbridge, will now explain. Right Worshipful? Right Worshipful, you are muted.
Thank you. Thank you, Right Worshipful. Good evening, brethren. We've just heard from Right Worshipful Brother Hotchkiss go over our Declaration of Masonic Principles in our very own New Hampshire Constitution. And as he indicated, these weren't adopted until 1939. I thought it might be interesting tonight to examine how these principles tie to the charges contained in Anderson's constitutions. For those of you who are familiar with Anderson's constitutions, you might be able to make some of these associations. For those perhaps who are not familiar with it, we can make that available to you. They're available in the public domain very easily. I think as an aside, you can take our current New Hampshire Constitution in its entirety and compare them to Anderson's constitutions in its entirety, and find that in this jurisdiction, we have remained fairly consistent and pure with the compilation of Anderson's formal Freemasonry going back to its acknowledged inception. One may even observe that the format of both is very similar. In Anderson, he delivers his charges before providing the Constitution. In New Hampshire, we provide a declaration of Masonic principles, and then we deliver the Constitution. I challenge you to make the comparison. I suspect that you will conclude that our foundations have been consistent with those of the original Constitution in Anderson. Should we not then conclude that when we have a Constitution that's based on a universal principle of truth, fundamental truth, it's no surprise that foundationally they've remained relatively unchanged? As you have just heard in the first New Hampshire principle, partly, we proclaim that these are heard as widely as men will hear. Anderson opens with giving a history of Freemasonry that is representative of this principle, as he gives a version that kind of ties back to the beginning of mankind. And while we don't hold it to be literally factual, but rather is affirmed in our declaration of principle that our universal truths have existed since the beginning of mankind. And I'd like to take a moment to read to you Anderson's very first charge to Masons is as follows: concerning God and religion. A Mason is obliged by his tenure to obey the moral law, and if he rightly understands the art, he will never be a stupid atheist nor an irreligious libertine. But though in ancient times Masons were charged in every country to be of the religion of that country or nation, whatever it was, yet 'tis now thought more expediently only to oblige them that religion in which all men agree, leaving particular opinions to themselves, that is, to be a good man and true, or men of honor and honesty, by whatever denomination or persuasions as they may be distinguished, whereby Masonry becomes the center of union and means of conciliating true friendship among persons that must else have remained at a perpetual distance. So I ask you, does this not directly tie to our fifth New Hampshire principle, declaring us to be monotheistic? And the reference of the volume of sacred law clearly ties to the foregoing, where we heard by whatever denomination or persuasion as they may be distinguished. In other words, that volume of sacred law is that we choose. I think that this New Hampshire principle clearly declares that reverence of God is present as the grand architect of the universe. And from that, we are concerned with the lesson of morality in a non-sectarian way without the dogma associated with a specific denomination. We also hear in the fourth New Hampshire principle that our system of morality and brotherhood is based upon the sacred law. Does this not tie directly to Article 1 in Anderson, which he declares this is to be good men and true or men of honor and honesty by whatever denomination? We now go to the sixth New Hampshire principle, which declares that while social in nature, we gather for providing education, worship, and charity. As a Mason, we are to obey the moral law. To do so, I think as declared in Anderson and in New Hampshire, are they not both declaring that providing education and understanding of the art, bound by this belief in a supreme being as we individually define it, and whereby in doing so, Masonry becomes the center of union and the means of conciliating true friendship among persons that must else have been remained at perpetual distance? Is this not what we came here to do? In the 7th New Hampshire Principle, we speak of the strengthening of character and personal righteousness and responsibility, which will enlighten and inspire the feeling of goodwill and charity toward all mankind. In Anderson's charge, Article 6.5, entitled Of Behavior at Home and in Your Neighborhood, he says we are charged to act as becomes a moral and wise man, and wisely to consult your own honor and that of the ancient brotherhood. Again, I don't think it's any accident that we see these principles restated in the New Hampshire Declaration of Principles. In New Hampshire Principle number 8, we state that we stand for the worship of God, truth as justice, as we heard in Anderson, in Article 1 concerning God and religion. Yet we are also charged to be orderly, civil, religious, and intellectual, and to be true and loyal to the country which we owe allegiance, and to be obedient to the law of any state in which we may be. Anderson, in his Article 2, entitled Of the Civil Magistrate, Supreme and Subordinate, declares that we shall be peaceful, subject to the civil powers. And I find it interesting here that he further declares that Masons have always been injured by war, and that we have always been known by our peacefulness and loyalty, our steadfastness, and promoted the honor of the fraternity. Principle 10 speaks to our Grand Lodge continued adherence to that ancient and approved rule which forbids the discussion of Masonic meetings of creed, politics, or other topics likely to excite personal animosities. What does Anderson charge? Well, in Article 6, and I think both in Article 6.2 and 3, with 2 being entitled Behavior in the Lodge While Constituted, and 3 being Behavior After the Lodge is Over and the Brethren Not Gone. We are admonished not to behave ludicrously or jestingly while engaged in lodge in what is serious and solemn. And then he follows in Article 6.3. He allows for the innocent mirth, treating each according to his ability. However, he calls an attention that any easy and free conversation, and I say this again, he allows for innocent mirth, treating each according to his ability. However, he calls attention that any easy and free conversation that would blast our harmony and defeat our laudable purpose not occur. I think he then goes on to say, as we specifically do in New Hampshire, he admonishes us not to engage in the quarrel of religion or politics. In short, politics and religion are never conducive to the welfare of any lodge. And he concludes it with this charge has always been strictly enjoined and observed, and we do today in this jurisdiction of New Hampshire. Our New Hampshire Principle 11 is also directly addressed by Anderson's Article 2. However, at the end of Principle 11, in New Hampshire, we are told that it is subject to the individual judgment and the dictates of our conscience. And Principle 11 further indicates that such adherence is also according to his individual judgment and the dictates of his conscience. And I think this, of course, is a profound Masonic foundation, evidenced in our obligations and the individual judgments of and dictates of our own conscience. I think that we saw these certainly in our own American Revolution and in the Civil War, where we found Masons answering the call to country, again, following the dictates of their conscience, but maintaining their Masonic principles throughout. And that in itself is a very long topic where we could show example after example after example of demonstrations of that. You might say, well, Dave, you kind of skipped right past New Hampshire Principle 9. I did, and I saved it for last. Because I think unlike Anderson, who specifically in our New Hampshire Principle 9, well in advance of many American jurisdictions, held that men of every race, country, sect, and opinion may unite rather than discriminate. And while Anderson is not really that specific on this issue, except as to religion, I think that we might close tonight with these thoughts on this principle. As we endeavor to uphold this principle, let us turn not to Anderson, but to our own ritual, and be reminded that as an entered apprentice, on that first night, we were charged to ever walk strictly in charge as a just and upright Mason. So let us ever abide by these Masonic principles and endeavor to do better. And as we hear at the end of every meeting from our master, as we conclude our work, I humbly suggest that amidst this pandemic, political vitriol, civil strife relative to this 9th principle, let us also remember that piece of our New Hampshire charge where we are charged as follows. Let the world observe how Masons love one another. These generous principles are to extend further. Every human being has a claim upon your kind offices. Do good unto all. And finally, brethren, be ye all of one mind. Live in peace, and may the God of love and peace delight to dwell with you and bless you. Thank you, Right Worshipful.
Thank you, Right Worshipful. So, brethren, we are certainly open to any questions or comments that you may have regarding these discussions. And while you're contemplating those, I would just kind of like to close with, as we heard, these principles weren't adopted in our Grand Lodge until 1939. However, they certainly trace back to 1723 or perhaps even earlier. And yet they are just as applicable today as they were then, and perhaps even more so. For in this technological world that we live in, with virtual Zoom meetings, with social media, Facebook, Instagram, we need to be cognizant of these principles as they provide us with the cable tow that tethers each of us as Masons to the tenets of our beloved craft and its teachings, allowing us to better serve each other and mankind, and thereby making this world a better place for all in which to live. So, brethren, I certainly thank you for your attention during this program. And I don't see any questions at this point in time.
There is one comment, Dan. Chris did something to help the YouTube audience.
Yep, he did share the link to Anderson's Constitutions within the YouTube chat itself. And I know we also saw those as we were going through the program, as well as the Masonic principles. And a comment from Right Worshipful Dave Cumming. Well said, and it brings even more importance to our opening and closing charges. I could not agree more.
Right Worshipful.
Right Worshipful.
I think that, and we heard this in a 2 master's class programs that Right Worshipful Busby and I were involved with, Area 51 and Network 23 this week, which went extraordinarily well, I think, well attended. But one of the topics that came up both nights is not just being prepared for an inspection and giving that your best effort. Certainly you should, but every meeting should be an experience. every degree should be an experience, and everyone should be attuned to getting your mind right, if that's the right word, so that you truly experience and listen to the words.
Agreed. And I've always said this, and I know a number of us have talked about this in the past, particularly when we're in lodge, when we hear that opening charge, it sets the tone for the meeting, for us and how to act when we're within that lodge. And the closing charge does the same, but for when we're outside lodge. And I thank you very much for your espousing on that. And from Right Worshipful Stickney, and I'll direct this to Right Worshipful Ackbridge, are there any parts of Anderson's constitutions that were not adopted by our Grand Lodge?
Well, this is one of those where I believe in telling the truth. I couldn't tell you, but I think at its core, we should say that we didn't adopt those. They were, and through this evolution, we have tended to find those things to be consistent with what we have done in New Hampshire with very little change. There are other jurisdictions who perhaps have gotten a little more aggressive in expanding on those, whereas in New Hampshire, we have stayed pretty pure. And I think you could probably go through, and I challenge, I think it's a very interesting exercise. We could probably spend a whole day doing a comparative analysis on the actual constitutional pieces in New Hampshire versus the actual constitutional pieces in Anderson. And I think generally what you would find is that many of the things, when you ask, well, why do we have that? Well, it exists in Anderson. And again, I challenge you to read it. There were actually two versions. He first published in 1723. He expanded, and there was a little controversy over 1734. But I won't elaborate on that tonight either. But in any event, I encourage you to do the challenge and maybe do the Andersons first, and then go back and read the New Hampshire Constitution. And it's just amazing at what we did adopt and how pure this jurisdiction has been.
Thank you, Right Worshipful. And Right Worshipful Collins, our Deputy Grand Master, actually placed a comment in response to Brother Stickney's question, saying that there were many parts that were not specifically adopted by New Hampshire, as you just noted, but there are many other jurisdictions that have many more items specifically included within their constitution directly from Anderson. And that actually, to some degree, correlates with the landmarks as well. We've adopted 8 specifically here in New Hampshire, but there are many other jurisdictions that adopted Mackey's 25, and some that have adopted well more than that. So they kind of all go hand in hand in that regard. I don't see any other questions. So brethren, thank you very much for your attention on this topic. We hope you found it intellectually stimulating as well as educational. And at this point in time, I'd like to turn it back over to our Grand Master for some final and closing comments. Grand Master.
Well, thank you once again, Dan, Dave. I thought you did a fantastic job tonight. I thought the programs that you spoke to are particularly pertinent in this turbulent time in which we live. Brethren, what you heard tonight are important lessons about how we as Masons are to live and act both within and without the lodge. I think we all recognize the fact that these are very challenging times in which we live. And sometimes life can be pretty darned overwhelming. And there are people that struggle with that. But brethren, I want you to know what sets us all apart. We're Freemasons. So what does that mean? That means that every one of those brothers who you surround yourself with stands ready to prop you up when you're down. When you're having a bad day, when things aren't going your way, you've lost your job, you're sick, you need some help, no matter what it is, there's a brother standing ready to help you out. Don't ever, ever forget that. So if there's anyone out there who feels like they're at the end of their rope, don't ever give up. Don't ever, ever give up, because we're here to help. Once again, I thank Right Worshipful Brother Hotchkiss and Ackbridge for a fantastic job. I thank Right Worshipful Brother Busby for the logistics of setting up this program. I thank Right Worshipful Brother Langis in the Grand Lodge office for the logistics of making sure everyone knew how to attend this event. And most importantly, brethren, I thank you. I thank you for being here and listening to this event, because without you, Freemasonry isn't. But it's because of you that Freemasonry is. I thank you for that. Right Worshipful Brother Hotchkiss,
Most worshipful.
we all set?
We are. Thank you very
All
much
right.
for those closing comments.
All right, brethren, thank you so much. Have a wonderful evening and a great week ahead.